Everyone, my name is Ian. I'm part of the CAT for ASDC, and I'm very, very happy to sort of launch the training program for ASDC with the posting of this lecture on international relations. Let's get right into it. So today's lecture will cover three key questions. Firstly, how do states behave? Secondly, what are international organizations? And lastly, how effective are international organizations at changing state behavior? It will be slightly lighter in terms of case studies because I think the most important use of our time is actually to discuss broad principles and ideas which you can then apply to each individual debate. Although I will try to cite a few examples that might be helpful in illustrating what I'm talking about. So let's start off with theories of IR. If you go into an IR 101 course in university, or maybe even in high school, if your high school offers that, you will probably encounter these three theories. I will try and explain to the best of my ability each of these theories and how you can use them in debating. But please keep in mind that, of course, this is a 1 hour lecture to cover material that usually takes about a semester in university to study. So all simplifications and mistakes are genuinely my own, and they do not reflect those who have taught me this material. Let's start with the first theory, realism. So realism is probably, oh, I'm realizing that my face kind of cuts out part of the slide. Realism is the theory, right, that probably is the most straightforward and that most people actually think about when you talk about international relations, like on a very basic level. And realism is just a theory that states are rational actors primarily concerned with security and survival. Um, so the idea here is that the international world order is different from behavior in a country. So within countries, for example, I, Ian, might be incentivized not to harm other people, right? Um, because I'm subjected to particular laws and regulations, and there's a greater power, the government, right, to stop me if I do that. But the international arena is what we call anarchic. There's no greater power, right, between countries. There's no greater power above a country to stop us from going to war, from invading each other, from seizing each other's land. And therefore, for realists, right, um, that means that the international world order, being anarchic, generates large amounts of instability, insecurity, and states which are obsessed or near obsessed with maximizing their chances of survival. This is because security is a prerequisite to everything else. And um, although economic might is important, right, and something that states do crave, they tend to crave it insofar as it generates more security for themselves. So the idea here is that states are naturally distrustful of other states in an anarchic international environment, and therefore they engage in militant balancing behavior. What does this mean? Militants means they arm themselves, they will uh, create military and military structures, they will try and seize large amounts of land to enrich the economy insofar as more money and a greater economy means that they can defend themselves in the case of war, and they engage in balancing behavior, meaning they try and form alliances with other states in order to be able to balance against other countries within the region. So that's sort of the broad principles of realism. Now, to be clear, the balance of power, right, refers to the tendency of different states to band together to counterbalance the power of other states, especially dominant ones. So what do I mean by this? So in realism, they believe that believe very strongly that the main reason why states don't invade each other or don't attack each other is because they know that doing so is likely to lead to their own destruction or the destruction of their own people, right? So it's not really a moral reason why states don't invade each other. It is primarily rational, that they are just disincentivized from doing it. And therefore, what realists are very, very concerned about is this thing called the balance of power, which is the relative amount of power between different states. Um, and therefore, uh, what realists notice is that when large powers exist, right, smaller countries tend to balance against them. Um, Meaning they band together and try and form trade relationships, defense agreements, defense pacts. That means that when larger states invade any one of the smaller states will counterbalance and essentially, right, um, come to the aid of the smaller countries, pooling their manpower and resources together to ensure their own survival and safety. Um, so in the balance of power, right, um, that's what balancing behavior means, and that's what the balance of power refers to. According to realists, this can result in a couple of different arrangements. The first is called unipolar balance of power, meaning there's one great superpower in the world, basically, or in a region. Um, I'd say that a good example of this is post post World War II, immediately, right? America was clearly the global superpower. Russia still had to catch up, actually, sorry, the USSR still had to catch up. And after the fall of the USSR, we went to another unipolar moment in the instance of USA, sort of becoming the world superpower again before China really economically grew and developed to the extent that it has now. Arguably, we are still kind of in a unipolar world, given that America is still the largest GDP. Um, yeah, it's still the largest GDP in the world. Um, but experts and sort of almost everyone basically agrees that America is not likely to be the unipolar power for long, even if it currently is. That we're now moving towards a bipolar or even multipolar world. How do I mean by this? Um, a bipolar world is a situation where there are two great superpowers. So, for example, America and the USSR, or America and China. And this is a power arrangement where there are two big superpowers in the world or in a region. Finally, there's a multipolar world where there are just multiple centers of power in the world. An example of this might be during the colonial era, when you essentially had like multiple different colonial powers like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal sort of being around, like and sort of establishing empires. Of course, there are many instances when Britain was a global dominant superpower, or Britain and France were the bipolar powers. But you get the idea, right? That a multipolar world is a world where the difference in power between um the greatest superpower and the next greatest is really not that large, and there are multiple possible groups or blocks that can vie for being considered the superpower, right? In the world environment. So that's what we mean by different arrangements in the balance of power. This can be a good thing for smaller states who can play large ones against each other. So the idea here is that in a unipolar world, right, America sort of ends up becoming the dominant superpower, and therefore has a mass amount of power to influence politics in other countries, to impose their will upon other countries, as we sort of saw through its control of international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But uh, arguably, when you have a more bipolar world, right, um, you essentially have two superpowers, America and China, sort of trying to compete um, for the alliances and deals, right, with all of the different countries, and that could be a good thing, right? It could establish um, essentially what's helpful competition. If you sort of remember the material that we might have learned in an economics class of very basic market competition, right? That can kind of apply to superpowers trying to vie for loyalty or vie for alliances with different countries in region. So that is what we call the balance of power, and that's realism. Now, how do you apply realism in a debate? Um, in debates, if you're trying to make arguments about something like nuclear proliferation, right, which can be a really hard thing to defend, it might be helpful to go, look, right now there's a very dangerous imbalance of powers between countries that have a nuclear powers and new countries that don't. The insecurity doesn't actually originate from countries having weapons. Countries always just have weapons as a natural feature of life, right? The insecurity occurs when countries have an imbalance of power between those with more weapons and more advanced military technology and those with less advanced technologies, which then stops the more powerful countries from being deterred from invading, annexing material from smaller countries. Um, it's also very helpful, I think, to just think of balance of power whenever you talk about debates where you have sort of like smaller countries potentially being um, potentially being infringed upon or strongly influenced by larger ones. You can explain that these small countries can often have alternatives. They can band together with other countries. They can form alliances with other powerful superpowers. So, for example, in the status quo, there's this thing called the nuclear umbrella, whereby different nuclear powers sort of make deals with other smaller countries to be within their defense capabilities. Um, so, sort of align yourself with a nuclear superpower could be a very good alternative. And we'll sort of talk about that later in our discussions about liberalism as well. Okay, so that's realism. Just to recap how we've talked about so far, realism is the most straightforward. Well, in my view, it's the most straightforward. And this is not the official academic view, but in my view, it's the most straightforward theory of international relations. It just states that states are rational actors which maximize their self-interest. It points out that in many cases, states are obsessed with security and with ensuring their own survival because survival is a prerequisite to everything else a state might do. Um, And it views the international arena as anarchic, a kind of war of all against all, really, where there's given that there's no greater authority than the state, states have to rely on their own military might or with alliances with other states in order to be able to survive and ensure the survival of their people. Therefore, states act to maximize their own utility, often by invading, annexing, um, pillaging other states, right, in the international arena. That's realism. Oh, I forgot. I forgot another slide. Imperfect information. This is another important characteristic of realism, which or an involvement principle within realism and sort of outside realism as well, which is that states often don't operate with perfect rationality. So realists, like we often have a phrase that a realist assumes like rational actors, and that's true. But they don't like that's not saying that like the academic realists don't actually mean that every state knows everything. They are very, very keenly aware that states have imperfect information due to the fog of war, and due to lack of trust in information. So the idea here is that if I might go to war with another country, let's say, I don't know, Iraq, let's say, right? And I there's a really good chance that I might try and invade, right? Iraq naturally has incentives to lie about their military capability, to try and portray their military as stronger than it really is, um, maybe even weaker than it really is, so that you underestimate my forces in the case of war. I don't know. There are incentives of these other states to deceive me, and um, this also is just due to inherent fog of war, meaning that in times of war you just don't know about other states' military capabilities, and you always have imperfect information there. Um, so yeah, as I sort of mentioned in the slide, right? States invasions work best when they're unexpected. Somewhat obviously. Okay. So so naturally, right? This leads to a kind of security dilemma where states don't know how many arms other states have, and therefore they sort of preemptively arm or possibly even invade other states as a result. Okay, that brings us to the end of realism. Now we'll talk about the second school of IR, right, which is called liberalism. So according to liberal theorists, right, states have strong economic pressures to engage in trade for mutual benefit, which then reduces war through various mechanisms. Um, so what do I mean by this? Um, Liberals sort of take a different view of state behavior. Remember what I said earlier, right? According to realists, states are rational actors, and that rationality leads them towards engaging in sort of preemptive invasions, preemptive conflict, annexing of territories, attempting to meddle in other countries' affairs, massive security armament, that sort of thing, right? Liberals, and the liberals in the IR sense, not liberals as in the political leaning sense, right? It's not the like, oh, we should have gender equality sort of people. These are different sets of people. Well, they're not necessarily different sets of people. It's different concepts, right? According to liberals, states have um, strong incentives to avoid that and can work together to avoid that situation of invading, of a war against of all against all. And according to liberals, right, in the IR sense, liberals, um, states engage in trade with each other due to the possibility of mutual benefit. Being able to profit um, from free trade means that countries have strong incentives to establish free trade deals, free trade agreements, um, partnerships, right, or trans national partnerships that then can raise the cost of war. And this is important. According to liberal theory, when states trade more with each other, they are much less likely to go to war. Um, the hard mechanism for this you can use in a debate is just that their economies are more intertwined. So, invasion of another state usually accompanies and leads towards a cessation of trade activities with the other state, and therefore that leads towards you know, um, a lack of war and a lack of war and conflict because you're just economically disincentivized from doing it. Um, it also means that a lot of the materials or the component materials you need to go to war are often imported from the very countries that you want to invade. And this is a big part of the reason why Europe, right, has not gone to war. Well, most of Europe, in Western Europe, has not gone to war ever since World War II, right? The idea here is that even like if you think about it, in up to and including World War II, that region was constantly at war with each other, right? Um, that's a big important feature of the context in which a lot of these IR theories arise, and they arose out of the ashes of World War II. And a very, very interesting observation then is that as these countries grew closer together, established the European Union, established international forums like the UN, um, that war, right, stopped. Like from nowadays, right, Germany invading France would be incredible when, 100 years ago it would be all news. So the idea here is that as countries get closer together and establish trade alliances, they naturally are far less likely to go to war and far less likely to go into conflict. So for realists, right, there's like the reason why countries don't invade each other is because they know that the other country can fight back. But for realists, countries don't invade each other even when there's a good chance of them succeeding at their military objective, because doing so is just economically costly, given that countries are interdependent in an increasingly globalized world order, right? So that's what liberalism believes. Um, and importantly, liberalism also emphasizes the ability of international organizations to curtail state actions. What do I mean by this? Liberals, as in uh, like in IR, right, have a reputation for being very optimistic. They have a reputation for believing that a lot of the world's problems can be solved through international organizations, problems like human rights abuses, corruption, all this stuff. And so, for example, you might have a UN Declaration of Human Rights, right, that says we ought to never, I don't know, use chemical weapons against civilians or use biological weapons against civilians, or we ought to not use landmines, right? And for a realist, these are all just nonsense. Like the gloves are off when the wartime comes. At the end of the day, the UN just does empty talk, and realists might point to examples of current genocides, such as the one currently occurring in Gaza, as the example of um, how international law really holds no water, right? But for liberals, right, um, you can try and change state behavior through something we call issue linkage, meaning if you have a good human rights record, if you have a good climate record, if you have less corruption, that shows your willingness to play ball in the international arena. Um, and what that means then is that uh, countries then see you as a trustworthy actor who abides by international rules and norms. And that is something that they actually want when it comes to establishing trade. And being part of an organization, having good diplomatic ties, can lead to flourishing trade. Like countries don't just magically trade with each other, or or these magically form trade deals. Trade deals and trade agreements are formed as a result of international forums, international cooperation, international platforms that countries can only really engage with meaningfully by playing ball, basically, by the rules and norms of that international organization. And so, access to that platform, access to a good reputation within that platform, access to good diplomatic relations, access to other countries, right, which view you as having norms, beliefs that are similar to theirs, is important for liberalism because it allows you to try and overcome, right, the world's problems through issue linkage in this instance. I, I realize I've sort of over-explained the point that I already had a slide on, but I'll just sort of like go over it again, right? As I mentioned, um, with a good reputation comes membership within international organizations and alliances such as the European Union. If you're one of the East European states post the fall of Soviet Russia, right, who really wanted to go into the EU, you often have to demonstrate that your compliance with certain norms and regulations of the EU, which then led to you socially liberalizing in many cases. Currently, you sort of see an instance of a country like Turkey has been applying forever to join the EU, essentially in many instances, trying to change its internal policies in order to fit those of the EU, in order to be able to gain access to that platform, for example. Um, there's also the idea that trust is important, that if you sign on to the convention, you are expected to abide by it, and being a predictable actor is important because it is just in your economic interest. to have other countries trust you and be willing to trade with you, and establish good deals with you. It is also important for investments. Businesses prefer a stable, predictable environment with guaranteed rights of property and safety. And to get that, you generally need to have a good human rights record, right? Um, and these are things that countries generally crave, and the countries generally get more of if they have a good reputation. Um, then there's also I suppose this is a little bit veering the constructivist territory, right? But also arguably, reputations are important for domestic legitimacy, because having a good international reputation can reflect on the quality of government. I'm not In retrospect, the organization of slides isn't perfect because this is a little bit more of a constructive issue, but and we'll sort of talk about constructivists later. But certainly, states and domestic populations do care about how their countries are viewed in the international arena. Having a whole bunch of other countries condemn your country just feels bad and undermines your sense of national pride, which is something that domestic populations do care about. Countries generally care about the way they are viewed, not only because of the ability to access international agreements and investment, but also because most people want to live in a country that's respected and liked, as compared to one that's revered and feared, or hated. All right, constructivism. Um, so just to recap what we've talked about so far, right? We've talked about realism, which is the international relations theory that states that countries are self-interested actors who um, who are in an anarchic environment and who balance against other states. Right? These are sort of um, key features of realism. Realists state that countries will invade each other unless there is a strong deterrence from doing so, either due to balancing of powers, um, or due to countries, as in countries banding together and sort of forming security alliances that deter conflict, or because the countries forming their own strong national militaries that just make them harder and harder to invade. Um, so that's realism. Liberalism refers to the idea that countries, although they are self-interested actors, right, can look beyond their self-interest to form cooperative relationships with each other due to the mutual benefits of trade. And um, trade can then curtail war because countries have good trade relations with each other. They are democracies. They have alliances with other countries. They can be even induced into establishing democracies, and good human rights records through issue linkage and the pressure to join international organizations and to safeguard their reputations. Um, that's realism and that's liberalism. Constructivism, the third theory, that is defined not so much by its predictions about state behavior, but by its methods as to how it's well, how it studies state behavior. Right? So according to constructivists, reality itself is socially constructed, including at the IR level. So you might have heard of the phrase gender is a social construct, right? And what feminists tend to mean when they say that is not to say that gender isn't real at all, right? Or that there's no one believes in gender. That's absurd. Um, but that a lot of the behaviors, norms, and beliefs we have about gender are socially constructed, right? Why is pink for girls? Why is it that women are homemakers? Why is it that I don't believe in any of this. Why is it that women are apparently less rational? Like these are gender norms, right? Or I suppose in many instances sexist beliefs, right? That are just socially arbitrary and socially constructed. Not to say that they are not um real in the sense that people believe in them and that they shape your actions and behavior and maybe even your world, right? But that it is a social construct that is contingent on the society that you grew up in. If you grew up in this society, you might believe this. If you grew up in that society, you might believe that. According to constructivists, that idea of reality being socially constructed is also true at the IR level. Remember what I said earlier. Both realists and liberals believe at some level that states are self-interested rational actors with particular interests and particular behaviors. It's just maximizing their relative power, meaning the amount of arms and weapons that they have, or maximizing their wealth, right, and the economic gain in the case of liberals. According to constructivists, All of these are still socially constructed. States don't inherently crave this or these things, but they only crave them because the people within them believe that these are important things. And so, what constructivists do is they take um, a different level of analysis as the other two actors. For realists, the unit of analysis should be the state. For liberals, it is states and international organizations. But for constructivists, they are perfectly comfortable examining all the way down to the individual level, like the individuals within a country, the social movements, the political leaders, um, the you know entrepreneurs, like the ideological entrepreneurs within the country, and then shape the way that countries establish beliefs in the international arena. So, uh, for example, right, let's take a case study of MAGA and tariffs. In this instance, Donald Trump's imposition of his Liberation Day tariffs in, I think it was April 6th, could be April 2nd, I'm not entirely sure. Let's say April 6th, right? Um, so from a liberal point of view, tariffs are irrational, right? That countries want to establish free trade and free trade agreements to increase their own wealth, clearly, right? Um, Tariffs seem to be irrational. Uh, for realists, tariffs might also be irrational, although less so as compared to for the realists. They naturally tanked America's stock exchange when they were first announced. It seems like irrational behavior. So that might be true, but a constructivist might argue that hey, um, the act of tariffing is actually within the beliefs and norms, right, established by the MAGA movement. MAGA belief, right, that tariffs are taxes on other countries probably facilitated the Trump's base, right, MAGA supporters who would the willingness of MAGA supporters to support him in imposing these tariffs, right, because they genuinely believe that these tariffs would not end up hurting their own people. Um, there's also a strong politics of grievance, meaning that there's a strong belief that other countries have ripped us off for too long. The trade deficit is inherently wrong, and that's sort of like later in the slide as well. That then means that although they would hurt the international economy and maybe even their own economy, they probably don't mind that much, because that ultimately signals that these are international actors who've been ripping us off so much, and that we ought to restore sort of balance of trade. And lastly, right, MAGA sort of and the MAGA movement, right, has sort of reordered America's priorities towards manufacturing. The idea that we ought to move American jobs back to America was not a priority, right? For most administrations pre-Trump, like Obama wasn't that concerned about that. Um, Even the Republicans, right? Although they do care about helping the manufacturers, they were also very much a party of free trade. It was Trump uniquely who really strongly emphasized making America great again, right? At least in part by revitalizing America's manufacturing sector. Um, so this is another instance, right, of um, of MAGA beliefs, right? Reordering America's priorities. Remember what I talked about earlier, right? That realists and liberals would take interest to be sort of fixed, or at least relatively fixed. For constructivists, a nation's interests might not be economic might or military might. It could be trying to protect your manufacturing sector, or trying to get back at whoever wronged you historically, right? Or trying to reclaim lost glory or lost territory in the case of Russia, and which oftentimes, right, for constructivists, right, is viewed as trying to reclaim territory it lost during the USSR, during the fall of the USSR. All of these are observations about beliefs and cognitive beliefs that constructivism allows us to examine that realists and liberals might not. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our isms, right? Our theories of IR. At this point in the lecture, we've talked about realism, liberalism, and constructivism. These three isms, right, give us differing views of how states behave and how states act. For realists, states are self-interested actors who act in very, very defensive, paranoid, often harmful ways, right, only to be stopped when there's a stronger bully that stops them. Liberals believe that states have redeeming qualities. Well, he's not like moralistic, but um, let me rephrase that. Liberals have a more optimistic view of state behavior, viewing free trade as a possible way by which states um, are able to curtail their most militant tendencies. That states can be induced through international organizations to change their behavior for the better, often by making participation in these organizations and their reputations desirable for these states. Constructivists go a step further, arguing that states can change their behavior and do change their behavior in accordance with beliefs. Um, and that and that these states, right, much like human beings, can have their beliefs, right, shaped at the international level and the domestic level, as we'll talk about more in our discussion of international organizations. So, what are international organizations? Um, so in, international organizations are sort of organizations of states, right? At least that's the sort of definition I'll talk about for this lecture. There are definitely international organizations like the Red Cross, which are not really comprised of states, right? But for the purposes of this lecture, I'll sort of focus a little bit more on like the ones that are made up of states and state representatives. Um, so they are um, platforms or forums where international norms and ideas can proliferate, as well as enactors of laws and proclamations. And they can also provide services such as multilateral banks. So, for example, the World Bank and the IMF, these are international organizations that sort of end up providing financial services. Um, so, when I talk about laws and proclamations, though, that's probably the bigger thing that IR scholars are more concerned about. Um, Remember what I talked about earlier, the idea that the international arena is anarchic? Arguably, international organizations which have binding laws, right, undermine that idea. So, for example, in the European Union's policies in terms of, food safety regulations, in terms of labor regulations, these are binding. Like countries have to abide by them, or they risk being fined. Um, Similarly, the UN Security Council, which is the UNP5, right? Well, the UNP5 and also non-permanent members of the Security Council has binding decision-making power, meaning that they are able to impose sanctions and punishments on the countries that do not abide by their proclamations. So these are instances of binding laws by international organizations. There are also examples of non-binding proclamations. For example, the African Union and ASEAN, both regional organizations, don't issue binding proclamations. In fact, ASEAN goes a step further and says we must have consensus, meaning every single ASEAN member has to agree in order for a proclamation can be made. Um, and very, very similarly, right? Well, actually, well, no, the outcome of that is that they are non-binding. You cannot impose something on another country with its consent, right? With its consensus, right? So they're both non-binding and consensus-driven. In the same vein, the UN General Assembly is non-binding, like it issues proclamations condemning um, or maybe celebrating, I guess, but a lot of times condemning, condemning certain actions, but it cannot change things in a practical way. They cannot force countries to do something, for example. So these are examples of binding and non-binding laws and policies, and the difference is crucial. Binding has teeth. It creates a material interest for you to do something, while non-binding doesn't. It just says we as an organization condemn X or call for X or demand X, for example. And you can sort of think of it as a difference between, let's say, your parents saying either you study for 1 hour in the evening, or I will not let you use the internet ever again until you leave my house. That's a binding resolution, or a non-binding one being sitting you down and saying it's very good to study, it's very good to, I don't know, practice debating. So that's sort of like the difference. So how do each of the isms, right, view international organizations? So according to realism, nations act purely out of self-interest, right? And and therefore international organizations kind of are just instances of empty talk, right? They can issue proclamations and they don't really mean anything. You can sort of imagine, remember the realist view of the war of all against all. Imagine during this war, someone says, "By the way, we condemn the way you're bombing this other country." Okay, this don't matter for realists, and um, And in some instances, international organizations can even be avenues by which powerful countries exercise their power, right? Um, so a very, very good way to use this in a debate is when you're trying to oppose the establishment of a platform for something. For example, trying to oppose um, whether we want a single international organization to, I don't know, regulate the waterways, right, or regulate the use of water, which is ABP pre-quartz motion a couple of years back. Um, According to realists, international organizations ultimately are still beholden to material interests. They need funding and cooperation of large, powerful states in order to operate, and therefore they are very much so just an indirect way by which powerful states are exercising power onto other countries. And you can sort of see this view play out whenever someone, maybe an adult in your life goes, oh, all of this is just empty talk and cheap talk, or oh, it is just America's way to try and strong arm countries into doing certain things through the UN, for example. Um, so that's sort of the realist view of international organizations. If you ever want to try and be more cynical about an international organization or more cynical about international cooperation, it's always helpful to sort of put a realist hat on and go, is this in the material interest of states? And so I'll be able to build arguments with that worldview in mind. Oh, I give an example of a motion like this, right? This helps to make World Health Organization resolutions legally binding. This is purely out of habit. Normally, for my live lectures and talks and lessons, I will let students come up with arguments and discuss those arguments. Given that it's obviously impossible in YouTube format, which where I know that this video will be posted, you can pause the video right now and I don't know, for like 5 minutes or something and think of arguments yourself. I'll let you do that. Okay, so you should have unpaused this video. Um, so the uh, I think that a very, very good realist argument in this motion, right, is the view that uh, the that if you were to make the World Health Organization resolutions legally binding, that could lead towards powerful actors either leaving the World Health Organizations or trying to use it as a platform to advance their materials of interest, right? Um, because the more you tie up an organization like the World Health Organization's operations with the material interests of states, the more unwilling they are to continue abiding by its laws and rulings, and the more interested they are in shaping this organization in order to advance its own interests by, for example, using it to condemn regional rivals, using it to interfere in the actions of regional rivals, etc. So you politicize an organization basically. And that is a realist argument, right? It's an argument that states don't really care about world health. They don't give a toss about, um, about actually eradicating diseases. And they care far more about their own materials of interest. And therefore, um, and therefore, they are far, far more likely um, to politicize an organization than to try and abide by its rulings if it has legally binding power. Okay, so how do liberals view international organizations? According to liberals, international organizations are critical mechanisms through which states cooperate. Um, so as I think that I talked a lot about this during the earlier part about liberalism, right? For liberals, international organizations um, are important platforms. They are the place where the deal can be made, right? If you think about it, like calling an embassy, for example, from another country, is important because if you don't have an embassy, there's no way for your people to cooperate like politically and economically. There's no place to pop down and make the next deal. If you ban foreign dignitaries from your country, there's no way to pop by and sit down and talk about the next trade negotiation. And these are all really big things for liberals because they are prerequisites to trade. And so countries do care about these sort of acts of symbolic condemnation, and they're not just cheap talk. Um, and indicating cooperativeness can signal trustworthiness, open the avenue for future collaboration, that sort of thing. So here's a second motion that I want you to try. Um, this house regrets the ASEAN principle of non-intervention. And I sort of realized I just gave you all like carte blanche to come up with arguments for the previous one. Let's zoom in this time. I want you to assume um the opposition side supporting the ASEAN principle of non-intervention. And in particular, I want you to explain why current ASEAN proclamations are effective, and we don't need intervention for ASEAN to be effective as an organization. Try and use liberal arguments for this. You can pause the video now. Okay, so you should have unpaused this video, right? So the uh, probably, right, what you want to say, using a liberal view of this, is that ASEAN countries care about free trade with each other, they care about their international reputations, they care about the way they are viewed by other countries, and therefore, ASEAN proclamations, even though they're non-binding, can be very, very powerful in terms of signaling what other countries in the region think of you, what your regional neighbors believe, um, and non-compliance with them can be very economically costly because it can signal that you are no longer a trustworthy actor, that you are no longer abiding by international norms and abiding by international stability. It can lead towards countries pulling out their embassies from your country. It can lead to them shutting down trade relations and trade deals with you. All of these are important in terms of establishing good relations with your neighbors. And these are all things that are far more likely if you are seen as playing ball, basically, in the international arena. Okay, last one, constructivism and international organizations. So for constructivists, right, remember, the international world order is socially constructed. Uh, it uh, it consists of populations and states which internalize certain beliefs, such as the importance of opposing climate change, or the importance of stamping out corruption, or the importance of human rights. And for constructivists, I think these forums um, where these things are discussed and talked about are genuinely places where countries adopt beliefs, right? That, for example, climate change becomes a big global issue, not only because the domestic populations themselves learn about it, but because delegates and countries, right, gain beliefs about these through international organizations like the UN. And so these organizations can oftentimes change the beliefs of the elites as well as domestic populations through speeches, symbolic gestures of friendship, alliances. Um, all of these things can really change the way states view their role in the international arena and their obligations to sort of their domestic populations and even to like humanity as a whole in an instance of global problems like climate change or securitization, right? So that's how constructivists view the international arena and international organizations. Um, all right, that brings me to the end of my lecture. Um, I yeah, I hope you all have had a good time listening to all the stuff about the different isms, about international organizations and how they behave. If you have any questions about this, uh, well, I suppose we'll see each other at ASDC, hopefully, right? So if you ever want to do so, right, hopefully while I'm not like in the middle of something, preferably, please feel free to sort of like just tap me on the shoulder or approach me with other people in the room, right? Not alone. Um, and ask me any questions you have. I'm very, very much open to it. All right, have a good one. Um, hopefully see you guys at ASDC if you are watching it before then. If not, see you around. Bye.